Hello, everyone. Welcome to the keynote. So I would like to introduce Anjana Rajan. She's the Chief Technologies Officer at Polaris Project. It's an organization, civil society organization working to combat sex trafficking and human trafficking in the United States and also internationally. So I would go straight to Anjana's keynote because I know that she has to leave at 1 p.m. So I would like to just listen to her talk, and then I will give a 5 to 7 minutes of reflection on her talk, and then we open to Q&A. Please go ahead. Welcome to this workshop.
Thank you, Roya. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Anjana Rajan, and I'm just so delighted and honored to be speaking with all of you today. I am the Chief Technology Officer of Polaris, and we are an NGO based in Washington, D.C. that fights human trafficking and modern slavery. My expertise is applying cryptography to national security and human rights issues. And I've always been interested in solving problems that protect vulnerable communities from dangerous bad actors. And I really believe that true societal change requires us to sit at the intersection of advanced technology solutions, multidisciplinary research, and nuanced policy proposals. This past year, I was a tech policy fellow at the Aspen Institute. And my work there was focused on a central question, which is how can we create privacy-preserving ways to prevent mass gun violence caused by white supremacist extremists? It's a mouthful, I know. Today, I'm going to share with you the work that I've done over the past year to address this problem. But first, I want to take you back to August of last year to two really extremely tragic events that happened in the United States. First was the mass shooting in El Paso, Texas, and then immediately the next day was a mass shooting in Dayton, Ohio. And as I often feel after these horrific mass shootings, I was devastated and frankly angry at the politicians who refused to take any meaningful action. They offered their thoughts and prayers and said there was no way to prevent these random acts of violence. But these two mass shootings were not random, because we know that the shooter in El Paso was motivated by white supremacist ideology. And we know that the shooter in Dayton was motivated by misogyny. And so I became really invested in this problem and began reading a lot about it. And there were three seminal pieces of research that really inspired me. First, I came across this research report published by the Soufan Center, which is a leading counterterrorism think tank here in the United States. And the report described how white supremacist extremism is a transnational political movement that poses a global threat. And interestingly, the report uncovered how these networks imitate the tactics and techniques of Salafi jihadist terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The way they recruit and radicalize is the same. The way they use technology is the same. The way they utilize violence for political means is the same. The way they go into these real world war zones, respectively like Syria and Ukraine, to train their warfighters is the same. And most surprisingly, white supremacist terrorism is responsible for more deaths on US soil than jihadist terrorism since 9/11. So after I read this report, it was clear to me that although white supremacist ideology is not unique to the United States, the lethality caused by this problem is exacerbated in the US because of the ubiquity and unfettered access to firearms in our country. And so after I learned that the perpetrators of the mass shootings in El Paso and Pittsburgh and Charleston and so many others were motivated by white supremacist ideology, I became interested in looking at mass shootings from a counterterrorism lens. This led me to the second important piece of research, which was a gun violence study conducted by the FBI that looked at the pre-attack behaviors of active shooters between 2000 and 2013. The most interesting insight from that study was that each perpetrator had, on average, 3 distinct witnesses who observed concerning behaviors prior to the attack. And some of these behaviors were quite severe, including the killer explicitly communicating an intention to cause mass harm. Unfortunately, nearly 60% of those witnesses did not report to the police. And the reasons for not reporting included distrust of the police, loyalty to the perpetrator, the self-doubt of their own assessment of the risk, and a desire to remain anonymous. So this really means that there's an opportunity for intervention and was missed and lives were lost. The final piece of research that influenced me was a report from EVERYTOWN for Gun Safety, which shows that the majority of mass shootings in the United States involve domestic violence. Specifically, 54% of all mass shootings involve the perpetrator killing a family member or intimate partner in the attack. Research also shows that misogyny, or the extreme hatred of women, is a common factor that underpins many terrorist ideologies and political violence, including white supremacist extremism. Therefore, one could argue that domestic violence is a force multiplier for violent extremism and should be treated with the federal resources it deserves. And more importantly, domestic violence survivors should be empowered to play a pivotal role in preventing mass gun violence caused by white supremacist extremists. The theory of change that I am proposing is, if we can address this low reporting rate of witnesses, especially among vulnerable populations, we can intervene appropriately before a mass shooting occurs and save lives. I have solved a very similar problem before, but in a different space. Before I came to Aspen, I was a CTO of a tech startup called Callisto. We focus on the low reporting rates of sexual assault survivors on college campuses. And the reason survivors don't report sounds very familiar to me. Distrust of the police, loyalty to the perpetrator, the self-doubt of one's experience, and a desire to remain anonymous. We saw this low reporting rate as a game theory problem, namely that there's a first mover disadvantage for coming forward by yourself, but if you can learn that you're not the only one, you're more likely to take action. So we created a product called a cryptographic information escrow. A victim can create a timestamped encrypted record of their assault, and nobody, not even Callisto, can see that data unless a second victim names the same perpetrator. If there's a match, the two victims are connected to a lawyer who will help them navigate all of their reporting options, ranging from taking legal action to pursuing restorative justice to everything in between. And the product works. Callisto users are 6 times more likely to report, they report 3 times faster, and we were able to detect serial perpetrators that would have otherwise not been detected by the police. And so I asked myself, how could a similar privacy-preserving technology be applied to this national security problem? Here's how I envision it could work. The first witness creates an encrypted record about the suspect and enters this into the reporting escrow. That report stays encrypted so that nobody, not even the escrow provider, can see this data unless another witness creates a record about the same suspect. The first witness can unlock the escrow independently if the observed behaviors are severe enough. The escrow is unlocked when a threshold of concerning behaviors are observed by 1 or more people. This creates a low-risk environment for a witness to report because nobody can see this accusation unless a credible threshold of risk is met. The records are decrypted by a legal counselor who is an attorney who provides free confidential counseling to the witness about their reporting options. The legal counselor provides 2 firewalls. First, as a lawyer, they can establish attorney-client privilege and protect these conversations against a subpoena. And second, they can filter out false accusations by malicious actors before they become escalated to law enforcement. The counselor then explains the variety of calibrated reporting options a witness can take, such as filing for a red flag law petition to remove the suspect's weapons, enrolling the suspect in a therapeutic program, or another non-law enforcement intervention. Reporting is incredibly risky for the victim, and while I was a CTO of Callisto, I became obsessed with making sure our product protected the privacy and security of our users. I have always had strong conviction that this escrow technology could be applied to a number of scenarios where you're trying to enable vulnerable people to speak truth to power. And I've spent the last several years of my career thinking about how to build escrows in a variety of social justice use cases. Today, I'm going to highlight how I think about this in 2 key ways. The cryptographic approach, which is an aspect I thought a lot about at Callisto, and then the policy approach, which is an aspect I thought a lot about at the Aspen Institute. So let's first talk about the cryptographic framework of our platform. We built this successfully in the sexual assault context, so I'm going to explain how we did this for a particular problem here first, and then I'll pivot and share with you how I thought about the policy side when applying this to a counterterrorism use case. So first, let's actually understand the user type and the user journey and the data we're trying to protect. So the way we think about it is in 5 stages. First, you have an invited user, who is someone who is granted access to the escrow platform. Then they become an activated user, who is somebody who has created an account on the platform. Once they've submitted a report, they're now called an escrowed user. And then once they've met the threshold of the escrow platform, they've become an unlocked user. And then finally, an assigned user is someone who's been assigned an options counselor and is beginning the process of learning about their reporting options and taking action. So we really need a system that understands that as a user progresses through the user journey, we need to ensure that their identity and their data are protected while still allowing them to share relevant information with informed consent. The full details of our cryptographic approach is outlined in this white paper, and I want to acknowledge a few of our collaborators who are working on designing this cryptographic scheme with me, including Lucy Chin, who is here on the call as well, Dan Bonet from Stanford, Tancred Lapointe at Google, David Archer from Galois, and Mayank Varia from BU. And today I want to focus on a specific piece of the workflow, which is the escrow user, because we utilize some really cool cryptographic techniques to ensure that nobody, not even the escrow provider, can see their data unless at least 2 survivors name the same perpetrator. And these techniques include an interesting use case of Shamir secret sharing, client-side encryption, oblivious pseudo-random functions, and federated key servers, which I will explain now. So let's say that we have a user, Alice, who experienced sexual misconduct from a perpetrator, Mallory. Alice wants to learn if she wasn't the only victim. She wants to get advice from an options counselor on her reporting options in a safe and privileged manner, and then make a decision that's best for her. Alice will input a series of unique perpetrator IDs, such as social media URLs, phone numbers, or email addresses, into a vector that we'll call P and other incident details into a record. We use an oblivious pseudo-random function over an elliptic curve across 2 federated key servers in order to randomize that vector P and obtain a high entropy value that we're going to call P hat. From this value P hat, we run a deterministic key derivation function to get 3 distinct values. The first one we'll call pi, which is going to serve as our matching index. The second is a value we call a, which will serve as the slope of our line. And finally, a value k, which will actually serve as the key. Using client-side encryption, we doubly encrypt the record using K and the public key of the options counselor. Using the line formula with the derived values A and K, we calculate the secret share defined as S equals AU plus K, which many of you will recognize as a formula of a line, where A is a slope, U is our hashed user ID, and K is going to be the key that's located at the y-intercept. We then send that hashed coordinate of the user ID and the secret share to the escrow database. So even though Alice has entered her record into the system, we cannot decrypt it without a match. And that's because we can't get that key K without another point on the same line in order to interpolate the y-intercept. Now, let's say there's another user, Bob, who submits a record and also names Mallory as his perpetrator, and the same unique identifier is P. That OPRF function, that oblivious pseudo-random function we talked about earlier, it's going to return the same exact P hat values, thus generating the same derived pi, A, and K values. But since Bob is a different user than Alice, his secret share will actually create its own unique coordinate that is sent to the escrow database. So it's important to note here that the escrow provider can't see the plaintext identity of Alice, Bob, or the identity of Mallory at this point. But the escrow matching algorithm can detect that both Alice and Bob share the same value pi, and so the system can actually now infer that both users belong to the same line. At this point, the options counselor is prompted to enter in their secret key, and they will interpolate a line to locate the key at the y-intercept to decrypt Alice and Bob's record. Now, at this point, the options counselors are seeing Alice and Bob's identity in the clear for the first time, but because they are lawyers, they've established attorney-client privilege with each victim to protect their conversations moving forward. Now, what happens if a third person submits a record with a different perpetrator? Let's say Carlos submits a record with perpetrator Sybil. You'll see that the pi A and K values are completely different. So connecting Carlos's point to either Bob or Alice's won't interpolate the correct y-intercept that would give them the key to decrypt the record. So this means that Carlos's identity is safe and mathematically protected. This means that no victim will have to fear coming forward with without the risk of knowing that somebody else has their back. Now, let's go back to the violent extremism problem. When you think about how to create a privacy-preserving way of preventing potential gun violence caused by white supremacist extremists, this problem is much harder because a crime has not yet been committed. And this was a crux of my policy work at the Aspen Institute. First, we need to clearly define what the threshold of risk is. And this is an incredibly challenging problem because You want to identify potential violence, but also while not infringing on a citizen's civil liberties. And so the policy question becomes, what should the warning signs of violent extremism be? How do we do this by focusing on demonstrated behaviors of hate and violence rather than stereotyping based on religion, race, or political ideology? And so I wrote a technical white paper that outlines a detail of this risk model that could potentially power the engine of a similarly shaped escrow. Second, when building products for a vulnerable population, such as domestic violence survivors, it's so important to understand that they have unique needs in these moments of crisis. I created a trauma-informed design framework to show how an escrow for this population should be deployed. Third, this model requires calibration with real data. I created a series of real-life case studies to run through the risk model to see where the edge cases might require tweaking and calibration. And finally, I built a demo app of this risk model to show how the escrow could be powered. You can test it out yourself at thewitnessapp.org. I want to highlight that this project intersects at so many multidisciplinary areas: counterterrorism, gun control, domestic violence, privacy and civil liberties, behavioral health, and of course, cryptography. And so a major focus of my time at Aspen was learning from researchers and experts in the field. Here are some of the informational interviews with subject matter experts I had during my fellowship that informed the details of my solution. I'd like to leave you all with some concluding thoughts. The events of 2020 really underscore the fact that mass gun violence caused by white supremacist terrorists continues to be an urgent crisis that requires a multidisciplinary approach. In the last 6 months alone, we've seen the following trends. We've seen white supremacist terrorist groups threaten to use a coronavirus as a bioweapon. We've seen spikes in gun sales. We've seen that domestic violence has increased significantly. And we've seen the public's trust in law enforcement drastically decline as police brutality and systemic racism persist. There is an opportunity amidst the chaos of this current moment to reimagine what public safety can look like. We can develop solutions that protect our communities from violent extremism, and that protect civil rights and civil liberties, and that create compassionate and calibrated de-escalation channels that go beyond a traditional law enforcement response. My hope was that this proposal could excite policymakers, law enforcement, and activists alike. We don't need to choose between national security and civil liberties. We can and we must build for both. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anjana. Thank you. The topic that you have been talking about, it's very, very close to my heart, because the reason that I left my field in engineering and went to human rights world is because during my volunteer work, I encountered with many women that they were dealing with domestic violence issue, and they helped me to draw a line between cyber stalking, cyber harassment, women's rights, and domestic violence. And thank you for helping us to draw this line between domestic violence, gun violence, and terrorism, because it's often very hard when people, they frame domestic violence as a private issue and counterterrorism as a public national security issue. But being able to draw this line, it's actually very helpful, not only for technologists, but also for policymakers nationally and internationally. So thank you very much. And to the point that you mentioned about your work at Costello and building the app, Witness app, it's so obvious that your work has been centered on the concept and principles of privacy by design. And this topic is very close to my heart, because in my work at the intersection of technology and human rights, I focus on the principles of human rights by design. And by that, I mean, by human rights by design, I mean focusing on privacy and security as values and principles that we should build in our process of designing and developing technologies, from the very earliest stage of ideation all the way to testing and prototyping. And for so many of the participants and mechanism design for social good based on the initial scanning of the posters and papers, I realized so many of them, they work on concepts of participatory design or value-sensitive design or human-centric design that are very much in line with your work on privacy by design and human rights by design. That not only putting privacy and security, but also working with the community to build certain projects. Because we, at least I, during my work with other vulnerable populations, including refugees, I have seen sometimes the approach is very techno-solutionist, meaning that they don't really co-design with the people that are going to use the system. But based on the conversation that we had before this talk, I realized that you even became a certified domestic violence counselor just to do this work. And so you have been working with so many different groups and with vulnerable populations themselves to be able to build this app. So I would be very happy if you could elaborate on this back and forth communication with the population and communities yourself during our Q&A session. The other point that I really enjoyed during your talk, it was about the conversation about national policy and connecting that to international policy. I myself, I am a dual citizen of the United States and also Iran. And sometimes when I hear about the conversation about domestic terrorism versus foreign terrorism, I think in the United States, they couldn't connect the national policy to international issues. And also, in terms of cryptography and end-to-end encryptions, we have been noticing that there have been a very heated debate at the moment at Congress. And you yourself, you testified at the Congress about this concept, that there is a group that they're very much focused on privacy, that they say that end-to-end encryption should be preserved with no doubt, because privacy is a fundamental right. And there are other groups that they're mostly focused on children's rights, people actually that they are dealing with human trafficking, there are victims of sex trafficking. So there are these groups that they say that, no, we have to have certain way to be able to protect these groups too. So there's always this like a very heated debate between these two groups. And I would be very happy if you could elaborate more on your recent Congress hearing and that you testified at the Congress about this issue. But I myself, when I think about or when I hear about this debate, I think what is missed is more like a holistic view and international view when we are talking about national policy. Because of my work in human rights, I think international human rights law might be a framework that would help us to get that kind of holistic viewpoint that all rights are interconnected and important. We shouldn't think about privacy as silo without thinking about the other rights. And also that these issues are not national issues, they are international issues, and countries, they have to be in line with each other about these issues. And international human rights law might provide this more holistic international framework. And the last point that I really enjoyed in your talk, it was about, you mentioned about distrust to law enforcement. And I'm sure that that point, it resonates so much, specifically during this time that we are dealing with the highest point of distrust to law enforcement after the killing of George Floyd. And also in so many cities, we have seen that people requesting for defunding law enforcement, including the city that I live in, Santa Cruz, California, that they're asking for defunding police, they're asking for more community-driven support, and creating a balance between how law enforcement should work with community in order to address some of these issues. As you mentioned, restorative justice a framework that is focusing on repairing harm instead of taking a 100% punitive approach to solving these issues. So with that, I would like to ask and reiterate my question about your approach in design, privacy by design, human rights by design, and the co-design approach that you took, because I'm sure there are so many people in the audience that they're interested in working as a technologist, working with community to build certain technology, but they want to know how to not only build this technology for them, but also with them. So if you could walk us through the process of developing your tool.
Well, thank you for the kind words, Roya. And Yeah, I think, my work that transitioned from Callisto into this space was a very serendipitous journey. It wasn't like I came in and said, this is a problem I want to solve, and here's this perfect answer. I was just a citizen watching this unfold in my country with the El Paso shooting and the Dayton shooting, and I was just very frustrated and became obsessed with this problem and just started reading a lot about it. And this, I think, highlights and underscores the importance of research in the role of innovation and the role of policy, because it was some of the existing research from these experts in these seemingly disparate fields that kind of made it come full circle for me. And so that final piece of research, which really underscored the correlation of domestic violence and gun violence, was a light bulb that went off in my head, which was, this is essentially the canary in the coal mine that we're ignoring, and we're not empowering this population to take action. And for me, my mantra is always just go where the problem is. And so I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I found, the largest domestic violence shelter in the city, and just asked them if I could go through the process of being certified. And I went through a 40-hour training over the course of 2 months. And it was incredibly humbling, because even though I had come from doing quite a lot of survivor-centered work, this was a whole new formation of it. And it made me understand the intersection of all these different issues, both immigration policy and racial justice or injustice, and the many forms in which this violence manifests. And when you think about what a survivor of domestic violence has to go through just to protect themselves, the burden is so high on them already, so that asking them to do yet another thing to protect their broader community is a big ask. And so part of why I wanted to really focus on this community and build out this framework for design was that we need to really start with the people we're asking to do this work, and really understand what is it that we need to understand and come to them with, rather than making them adjust to us. And so this is something that is not just unique to this project, but a lot of survivor-centered work that I've done centers around trauma-informed design, and really thinking about what are the ways we can build solutions and build technologies that don't re-traumatize and create secondary and vicarious trauma. And privacy is a big part of this. And I think part of what has drawn me to cryptography is that I find it to be so intrinsically mission-oriented, because at its core, it's about protecting others. And so I've really made that part of the intrinsic design process, which is, what is the trust model? Who should they be able to trust, and who shouldn't they be able to trust? And that's something that I always ask myself when thinking about building these tools. And I think as you work with different populations, you can understand that the trust model may be more relaxed or maybe more stringent, and then working from there. And then the design part becomes pretty intuitive, and you can say, okay, now this is what needs to be built. Now, as you saw, the cryptography piece was really complex and thoughtful, because at least in the sexual assault space, we were dealing with a really complicated threat model, where we were worried about legal retaliation and physical retaliation and all these other things. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were making sure that nobody had to trust us. They could say, I don't need to trust Callisto or whoever is building this product. I can just know that this is mathematically protected. And the collaborators who worked on this with me, we really thought an elegant solution that really leveraged the mathematics was actually the best way to go about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for your very thoughtful response. And then in line with the process that you mentioned, that we have a question from the audience about the verification process, that how you can, when you receive any kinds of reviews, you review that as like is it a fake review? What could be some of the ways that malicious actors, they try to send a review? And if you could walk us through the review process and verification process, that would be great. It's a question from Hamza Bastani. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, you talked about your personal connection to this issue, Roya, and I am a South Asian immigrant who grew up in upstate New York in the post 9/11 world. And when I think about 9/11, I think about the Patriot Act. So for me, the impact of our counterterrorism policies, in my opinion, have had many civil liberties flaws, and it's something that I care deeply about just from my own lived experience. And now we fast forward nearly 20 years, and the domestic terrorism problem looks fundamentally different. It's white supremacist extremism, it's anti-government extremists, it's conspiracy theorists who are fueling a lot of this hateful rhetoric. And so we look at the data and we see like there is a new type of adversary that is in our backyard that we're ignoring because of the systemic racism that exists in this country. Yet in spite of that, I still wouldn't want those groups of people to experience what South Asian and Middle Eastern populations experienced in the early 2000s. And so it was really important for me to design a system that said, how do we recognize that this could swing completely wrong in the other way? And that what excites me about this problem, these types of problems, is that it really requires a careful threading of solutions. So you can't just use, we can't just over-optimize on one virtue. We have to really make sure we're thinking about this in constant balance. So when I was writing out the policy recommendation, I thought about what are the core foundational frameworks of an escrow, whether it's being used in this use case or any other social justice use case, and how do we think about those principles? And one of the 4 principles that I really emphasize is the importance of this human legal firewall, which essentially means we don't want to over-automate these solutions because you need to have the ability to analyze something to make sure that it is or isn't malicious. And this is really, really important because you want to make sure that you're protecting the privacy and civil liberties of both the victim and the accused. And you want to create compassionate, calibrated responses that can not over-optimize on incarceration, because that certainly is not the outcome we want to index on, but really thinking about what is it that I need to, what action do I need to take to avoid mass gun violence? And so you'll notice in the policy proposal, I talk about a lot of non-law enforcement interventions, including the utilization of red flag laws, which is a state-based policy that allows the courts to confiscate somebody's weapon temporarily and make sure that they're not at risk to the general public. We've talked a lot about in the counterterrorism community the importance of therapeutic wraparound programs. So how do you apply a behavioral health framework to a lot of this violent extremism? And so we think about this again in taking some of the lessons we've seen in the behavioral health space to this problem, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're building a society that doesn't create, that doesn't fuel the prison industrial complex or fuels a broken criminal justice system, but really thinks about public safety in a more holistic way.
Thank you so much. And it's very much relevant, I'm sure, to the work of groups that they work on human in the loop when they think about like technical design with working with civil society in order to have oversight on this technical design. Thank you very much. And I wanted to ask you about the dichotomy between privacy rights group that they want to complete 100% end-to-end encryption versus the groups that they are so concerned about children's rights that they are thinking about some sort of client-side scanning or any sort of way that the platform can actually verify and see the report. I'm not sure if you have time, but if you have time and give us like some few words about nuances that you face and how we can just break this dichotomy between privacy versus children's rights.
Yeah, and I'll leave this as like hopefully parting words to this group about why folks like you all are just so critical in the policymaking process. As you mentioned just a few weeks ago, I was asked to testify before Congress about the role of technology in fighting human trafficking. And I chose to use my time to testify on why the debate on encryption is actually a misleading one, because we're fighting over kind of 2 important values. We all agree we want to have an internet that protects our freedoms, and encryption is such a key part of this. But we also want to hold perpetrators accountable and make sure that we can protect vulnerable communities. And we've seen over the many years that we're having this argument over whether or not we should build backdoors to encryption and whether encryption is the villain in this fight. And I use my time to say this is actually a false dichotomy, because encryption protects victims and survivors. And I talked a lot about escrows as one of these examples. Some of the other examples I talked about were in the fight against human trafficking, because trafficking is intrinsically a commercial enterprise, the financial transactions are a key part of the evidence, and using those transactions are actually really trauma-informed, because it means that the victim and survivor aren't actually required in convicting these crimes against the people who profit off of them. And so the financial institutions and the banks are key players in sharing this information. Now, but if you're a major bank, you're obviously going to be reticent to just hand over your unencrypted data to a regulator to see this. And so what I talked about in the testimony was, how can homomorphic encryption actually be a technique that's allowing us to analyze encrypted data sets without ever seeing the raw plain text. The other piece that I talked a bit about, which may seem obvious to this audience, but you'd be surprised it's not obvious to a mainstream audience, is we often have an argument about whether cryptocurrency is a good or bad thing. And the de facto argument that we often hear is, these bad actors use cryptocurrency, therefore we should ban cryptocurrency, or we should regulate cryptocurrency. And the argument I was making was, A, that's probably not politically feasible, and you're probably gonna get a lot of pushback from civil libertarians and private sector advocates of cryptocurrency. Second, you're just treating the symptom. If you kind of add friction to this one type of currency, there's going to be new types that pop up. But most importantly, you're missing like the intrinsic value of this technology, which is, this is a public open source ledger. And when you create a crypto-based currency, what drives the legitimacy of the currency is that this is on a immutable ledger that you can all see. And so you're missing like all this evidence that you can actually now analyze and actually map out the crime networks and actually find them and dismantle them. And so this was the crux of the conversation. But what I hope all of you take away from this is, as you think about your own domains of expertise, helping folks understand how these technologies actually work is the first step of making effective policy. And also start collaborating outside of your own domain into other forms of research and seeing where the patterns can be matched. As you notice, I am not necessarily, I'm certainly not an expert on political science or counterterrorism or any of these things by trade, but when you start seeing the patterns of work you've already done and saying, hey, this can be applied elsewhere, find those collaborators, use conferences like this to meet people in completely different spaces, and start seeing where your work can actually intersect, because it's really that intersection that creates brand new ideas that are obvious to us but may not be obvious to other folks.
Thank you, Anjana. That's a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much. And I think one thing that I really like about mechanism design for social good working groups, that I hope folks, they get the chance to talk and go to this gather town and networking session to familiarize themselves with working groups, is that to be able to connect all kinds of interdisciplinary research and working with civil society groups. I would like to thank you for all your thoughts and insights and technologies that you shared with us. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for listening.